So inside, okay. Wait a moment. I try to delete this page. Oh. Okay. Okay, from this definition, you can see that the psycholinguistic concentrate on the study of the mental aspect and the skills concerning language understanding and production, and then the acquisition of these skills. So in psycholinguistics, we study both the first language, the second language, maybe the multi language. That for the present in the world, the people know more than one language already. So this is the main issue that the psycholinguistic interest and focus. And in my book entitled Modern Psycholinguistics, I also summarize that psycholinguistics has to aim to investigate. This is the main aim. The first one, we investigate the mental representation and process. This keyword is the representation and process that underlying language processing. For example, the representation and process of how the people perceive words and store the word in the minds, or how the people understand a sentence, how to read, how language and writing system influence mental organization. For this last issue, how language and writing system influence mental organization, I think this issue is very interesting because from the previous research, we found that the people who know different language will have the difference of the mental organization, concept organization. So this one is a field that for me is very interesting to study across language. And the second aims, the psycholinguistic also investigate the factors that influencing language processing. So there are many different factors that we can study in psycholinguistic or in ELT. From according to my experience, I saw that some research work on the first aims, some research work on the second aims, and some work on both the first and the second aims. For example, my research that I like to conduct, I will conduct to study both the first and the second aims because I think that the study of the representation and process is related to the study of the factors. For example, the age of the subjects, the background of the subjects will have the influence to the representation and process underlying language processing in the subjects. For this slides, I try to summarize the major scope of psycholinguistics because in fact, psycholinguistics study a lot of issues related to the language situation, language problems in the real world. So for this lecture, I try to summarize the major scope of psycholinguistics to give you the bird's eye view what psycholinguistics study. And then in the final of this lecture, I will give you the technique the major techniques that psycholinguistics use to study the language processing and representation. For this slide, the first scope of psycholinguistics is the study of language and the human brains. This issue is very interesting because psycholinguistics focus on the relationship between the human brain and the language representation and processing. For example, we study that which part of the human brain take the responsibility in a particular feature of language uses. For example, the pronunciation, the knowledge of the meaning, the knowledge of the grammar. In some cases, usually from the previous study, in some cases, we found that when the human have the damage of the human brain, it will influence to the difficulty, the problem of language uses in some particular feature of the language. However, to study the relationship between the language and the human brain, the researcher need to have the technical instrument that's special to study the human brain like that. And the second scope, I think the second scope is a popular scope that we can apply in the ELT research. This scope is that we study the language processing. For example, we study the language perception. For the word perception, I use this model to explain you two concepts that important to study the language perception. From this model, you can see that the input is the auditory word. And then we have the word perception at this state. And then the word recognition at this state. Because in the psycholinguistic, we explain that when you hear the continuous speech into as the input into your ears, it means that you hear. But if you hear it and you can perceive it as the input, we use the word perception. And when you get the perception input, and then the input go to access your language knowledge that you have in your mental, we use the word recognition. So this is the three states of the technical term that we use to explain when the person hear the language, hear the speech. And this three words is also applied when the person get the input as the writing language. So for the word perception, the study that we interest, I summarize as two main issues. The first one, we interest that how listeners can divide the continuous speech as a sequence of discrete units. What does it mean? For example, when you hear my conversation, when you hear my voice, I talk to you as a continuous speech. But we interest that when the listener hear my voice, how the listener can chunk the continuous speech as a discrete unit. For example, kanjang is as the sounds, the separate sounds. Kanjang is as the word, as the sentence. So this one that we interested that how what is the process that the listener use to hear the continuous speech, and to separate is at a discrete unit, and from the discrete unit, how the listeners use discrete unit to recognize that the word knowledge that they're stored in the mental, in the cognition. And then we study the feature of the speech and the factors that can cause the difficulty for listeners. Because in the previous research, we also found that different features of speech and different factors can cause the different difficulty for listeners. And if we know that which feature or factor that can cause the difficulty for listener, you can apply this knowledge to design your teaching material, your teaching technique, your teaching methods, or also your curriculums or the short course that can help the person to listen better. So this one that I try to give you the example how you can apply this concept of the psycholinguistic in your ELT research. And maybe you can get the idea to use a psycholinguistic issue in your research. And the second topic under the language processing is the study of identification and recognition of words. These are very important in the concept of psycholinguistic because in psycholinguistic we have important assumption that the person who have the good skills of using any language, there must be developed the good knowledge of word. We believe that if you have the good knowledge of word in your cognition, it will lead to your better skill in that language. So in the psycholinguistic, we have the concept of the word knowledge. So for the study of the word knowledge, we have two important basic concepts. The first one is the identification, and the second one is the recognition. What is the difference between the identification and recognition? I will explain you in simple explanation to give you the simple understanding that what the difference between the identification and recognition. For example, when you hear the word in, for example, I am the Thai native speaker. When I hear the word in English, I hear it before, then I perceive. So I will map the word that I hear into my word knowledge in my cognition. So in my cognition, I will have the many words that is possible to map with the English word that I hear. But what is the important feature that help the person to map the heard word with the many words in your cognition? Maybe the first one is your skills. For example, if you hear this word frequently, it will make you faster to map this word into many words that in your cognition. And after you mapped this word into a particular word for many words in your cognition, then you will recognize all of the information about that word. In psycholinguistic, when we talk about the word knowledge, it will not only the meaning, but word knowledge include all of information about that word. For example, the grammatical function of that word, the stylistic when we use that word, and maybe the situation that you use that word. Because for example, the information that I mean about the situation, for example, to use that word in the formal situation, in informal situation, or to express any attitude about that word. So all of this is all of the information that include in the word knowledge. So in my opinion, this information and the process that occur when we study the recognition of the word and identification of the words. It's very interesting to conduct many research concerning this topic because there are many issues that you can select to studies and can relate this issue to the study of the second language acquisition, the third language acquisition, or the multilingual studies. So the next issue is the study of the mental lexicon. In fact, this issue is related to the second issue, that the language processing. You can relate the study of these two issues together and make your research is more interesting in this field. For the mental lexicon, in fact, this scope is an issue that I study in my PhD, and I also continue study this issue in the later research. For the mental lexicon, in fact, this one has a long history in psycholinguistic studies. I think that you can see the example of the study of the mental lexicons. For example, the database about the many language in the previous work. This comes from the concept of the mental lexicon. The first one, I give you the definition of the mental lexicon before, because from my experience, I saw that many people don't understand that what is the mental lexicon. Usually they compare the mental lexicon as the dictionary, the book dictionary that we use. But in fact, the concept of mental lexicon is different from the dictionaries. From the definition of the mental lexicon, you can see that the important keyword is the cognitive system. And then it has the roles in the conscious and unconscious lexical activities. This is very important because when we use the language can be processed in both the conscious and unconscious situation. So the mental lexicon plays a role in both the conscious and unconscious language activities. For the second definition that I select to show you is that mental lexicon is the human long memory. This definition relates to the concept of psychology, that it has a long memory, short memory, contemporary memories. But the mental lexicon is the long memory that contains the speaker knowledge of words in his or her language. So for example, if you know more than one language, more than two languages, you will have the mental lexicon for all of the language that you know. And the study of the relationship between the mental lexicon across many languages is a popular issue in psycholinguistics. And the third definition is that the mental lexicon is the center of the language processing. So this keyword is the language processing. So from all of the definition that I select to show you today, I summarize that there are three concepts that are important for the mental lexicon. The first one is the cognitive system. The second one is the knowledge of words. And the last one is the processing. And that I told you that the mental lexicon is different from dictionaries. I will give you the basic information that what the difference between the mental lexicon and dictionaries. For dictionaries, when in one book of dictionaries, the word will organize based on one criteria. For example, it will organize based on the order of alphabet. And if we use the dictionary that we call it thesaurus, the word will organize based on the meaning of the word. And if you use a dictionary to find the meaning of a word or find an information of the word, you will have only one way to find a word that you want. But for the mental lexicon, the concept in the language learner have in their cognition, you can find the word in many ways. So in the psycholinguistic, we agree that the mental lexicon is very flexible. For example, if you hear the word, you can use the sound of the word to find the information in the mental lexicon. If you read a word, you can use the orthographics of the word to find the information of the word in the mental lexicon. And if you want to speak, you will start from the concept that you want to speak. So you will use the concept to find the word that appropriate to use to speak or to write. So this one that we mean the mental lexicon is very flexible for the language users to process. So if the mental lexicon is very flexible, we interest to study that how the humans keep the knowledge of the word that we call the word stored in the mental lexicon, and how the humans use what process to access the knowledge of word from the mental lexicon and process the knowledge from the mental lexicon to another step of language usage. For example, I access my word knowledge from the mental lexicon. So then next process, I have to control my articulation to pronounce that word that I select. So all of this process will start from the mental lexicon and continue to your articulators that related to your speaking, or continue to your hand and finger related to your writings. So all of this process, we can study it in the field of psycholinguistic. And according to the previous work in the psycholinguistic, the mental lexicons will focus on two main aspects. The first one is the storage of the mental lexicon, that I will use the easy word to explain. The storage is the study of how you keep your word knowledge in the mental lexicon. And the second issue is the access of the mental lexicon. This issue is concerned that how the person retrieve the word knowledge from the mental lexicon. And the investigation of these two issues will include the study of the factors related to the storage and the access of the mental lexicon. For the factors that we usually study, the first one is the word frequency. What does it mean for the word frequencies? The word frequency is mean that the more often I try to explain is easy. More often you see, you use this word. So the word that we usually use or the word that we often use, see or listen will be keep dominantly permanent in the mental lexicon. And when you access it, this word will be on the first list when you access. So you can access very easy about the information of this word. For examples, if I have the word list that this word I use every day, I speak every day, I read every day, I will recognize or I will know the meaning of this word faster than the word that I don't use, that I never see before. So this is the concept of the word frequency that we study, or the concept of the context and semantic characteristic of the language. Because we found that if we study the mental lexicon in the context of many languages, for example, you have the knowledge of your native language, for example, Thai, Burmese, Laos, Indians, and you use the English as the second language. You will have the word knowledge of the English. And then if you study, for example, Chinese as the third language, all of these languages will have the particular semantic characters that are different. So what the difference between the semantic characteristic of this knowledge play the role when you store the knowledge in the mental lexicon and play the role when you access the knowledge from the mental lexicon. And if we know that what is the important characters play the role when you access or store the mental lexicon, it will be a benefit when you decide the way to help your study to facilitate the learning of many languages. You can concentrate that which characteristic of language is easier to study, which characteristic of language is more difficult than the other characteristic to study. And then you can decide step by step to help your study to acquire, to understand the second language or the third language, and help them to study, to learn, to acquire better. Then you don't concentrate on the factor that have the influence in their knowledge. So the next scope of the psycholinguistic is the language production. In the language production, we usually study the process that the person used to produce the language. For example, in speaking, in writings, and what the factors that influence this production. So for the study of the language production, usually it will relate to the study of the mental lexicon. And in many theory, it will design the models to explain the language production. So when we choose which model that appropriate to our study, we should study the background of that model. For example, some model is developed to explain the human production. Some model are developed to explain the human production in the case of the native language, some in the case of the foreign language, and some the model will apply to design the language production in computer, in AI. So when we select which model that are suitable for our study, we should read or we should find the information of the backgrounds that the model is developed. So the next scope is about the language acquisition. From the previous study, I divide it as the study of native language, bilingualisms and multilingualisms. So the study of acquisition in the native language, usually it will concentrate on the ability of the person to acquire the first language unconsciously, look like it the innate abilities and the factors that influence for the step of the acquisition of the native language. So for the language acquisition in the bilingualisms, usually concentrate on the process and representation and the factors that influence to the acquisition of the second language. And also the present. The study of the language acquisition in multilingualisms is very popular because in the present times, the person in this world learn the language more than 2 languages. So, however, the issue of the language acquisition in multilingualisms, some issue is different from the bilingualism. For the study in the bilingualisms, rather than we interested in the study in the representation and process in the factors, but we also interested to study what is the influence of being multilingualisms will influence in your cognition. From the previous study that I read and found that they study, some results in the study on multilingualism show that being multilingualisms give the benefit in the development of your general cognition. The simple explanation is that if the subject know more than 2 languages, they can generalize the knowledge of many languages as the knowledge of the culture, as the knowledge of the world related this language, and this knowledge will help them to develop the cognition. So this research issue is very interesting, and however, it will need more research to support these findings. But however, for me, this finding is very interesting because if it trues, we can imply the skill of multilinguals to be the benefit to develop the person general knowledge, general cognition, and maybe lead to the further mental abilities. So for the last issue of the psycholinguistic, the first one is concentrate on the first or native language study. And the second one, I use the word cross-linguistic because I think that for the present time, linguistic does not concentrate only 2 languages, but we concentrate multilinguals. So for in this slide, I give you the example of the study of psycholinguistic that interested to study more than 2 languages. So I give you internal reference for the some work that study the language more than 2 in both in the aspect of acquisition, production, comprehension, and also many processing abilities. And the last line of this paragraph, I give the example that what cross-linguistic study involved. For example, developing the language teaching materials or the experimental methodologies. So from the slide that I show you the scope of the psycholinguistic briefly. If you're interested in any scope, in fact, in each scope, it will have the different theory, different model, different research in the subfield of each scope. So you can study more if you're interested, and if you have any question that would like to ask me more for some scopes, you can ask me. And before I will move to the next section, that I will specify to the second language acquisition in detail more. I would like to hear your look like that sharing your opinion, or if you have any question concerning the major scope of psycholinguistics, you can ask me for the present times, because I would like to hear your voice. And I would like to see your face, the face of the participant, the face of the lecturer or the student who attend this presentation. You can ask me any question or share your opinion, your experience at this time before I will move to the next slides or the next part.
Then James, you will be the first one, I think.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, Professor, in your talk, you are going to focus on bilingual and multilingual, right?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Okay. As you are presenting, I'm looking forward to see if what I'm curious about will be presented by you. Okay. Before this session, okay, as my experience as a language learner, and also my students, okay, okay, I noticed that those who are learning more than 2 languages, for example, the native language is Thai, the second language is English. Okay, if they have been studying English for many years and they are a good English learner, okay, with good grades, or if they are English high achiever, when they come to study the third language like Japanese and Chinese, they also work and do well for those subjects, Chinese or Japanese. I can say this because Japanese and Chinese are provided in my university, and they could do well. So in my summary from my notice is that if they work well in the second language, they could also work well in the third language or even the fourth language if they have a chance. Okay, this is what I noticed. So I would like to know and understand the psycholinguistic system or the linguistic system for those people. Yes, and also I would learn from you today what causes that phenomena. That's why they could work well in all the languages, even though the systems or the grammatical structures or the words or the cultural background of those languages are totally different. You see, Japanese and Chinese are in Asia, and English is in the Western world, but they could do it. This is what I would like to understand more, professors, from the talk today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ajahn James, for your question. For your question, I will divide the factors that influence these learners as 2 main types of the factors. 2 main. The first one we call is the individual factors. That the factors that is the characteristics of any learners. For example, the motivation, the interest, these the individual factors. Another factors is the external factors. I call it the external factors. To make it different from the individual factors. The external factors is look like that. For example, the first one is the language factors. From your question, you compare between Thai, English, and Chinese or Japanese. So the characteristic of each language is the language factors. And in the psycholinguistic, we will focus on the difference level of the language factors. For example, Thai and English, what is the difference characters? Thai and Chinese and Japanese, what is the different factors and what is the shared factors? All of these factors will influence the ability to study across language. And another type of the external factors that I concern is the environmental factors. I use the word environmental because I want to focus that this factor is not the individual factors. It's not the factor from the language itself, but it's the factor that the learner obtains from the outside themselves, outside the language system. These environmental factors include the factor, for example, your teaching and learning environments. That is, the teaching and learning environments can be separate, look like that: formal teaching and learning environment, informal teaching and learning environments, or the other factor that not the teaching and learning, but the learner obtain from the context around themselves. For example, obtain from the daily lives. For example, if they use or have the chance to practice this language in daily lives, not in the classroom, not from the teacher, but they may be practiced by themselves, practice from the media, from talking with the friends. All of this is the factor that I concern as the environment. So from in my opinion, to answer Ajahn James' question, I will summarize that I concern that as the two main factors. The first one, individual factor that come from themselves. But for these individual factors, the teacher, for example, us, we are the teacher to teach the language to the student. We can help them to improve, to facilitate the individual factors. For example, if they have the low motivation, if they don't interested in that language, the teacher can provide the way to facilitate, to increase these individual factors to the student. And the second factor that I focus is the internal factor. The first one, language factors, that if we are the teacher, we know that what characteristic between this language will be easy to the student to learn, will be difficult to the student to learn. We can prepare the way to help them to learn the easy characteristic and help them to be better, faster, easier. And the last one in the external factors is the environment. If we are the teacher and we're concerned that which environment will help them to learn by themselves, not depend on us like that, we may give them this factor, this instrument, this context to help our students to have more chance to be better. So in my opinion, this is the factor that concerning to the study of the course language. But if we study the other issue in the psycholinguistic, because I present that psycholinguistic have the many different fields. For example, the field that I show you, language acquisition in multilingualism, that I show you the finding that being multilingualisms have the influence to the general cognition. So if you work some research work from the different way direction, start from the developments of the general cognition and may lead to the better developments of being multilingualism also. But however, for this research, I think that if you study in detail, you will find that there are many issues that related to the development of multilingualisms. And some research we found that maybe the ability to use the third knowledge will provide the facilitation to the ability of the second language, the first language as well. So there are many directions that the language will be development. Maybe the first facilitate the second and facilitate the third. Maybe the third can facilitate the second and the first also. And sometimes it may be the language loss that this can occur as the language facilitation. So it can be both direction. Okay, thank you, Ajahn James, for your question. I try to explain. In fact, I try to explain it as I think that it's simple and try to make it easy to understand. But if you don't, if you don't understand clearly, you can ask me more.
Thank you, Professor.
Ajahn Mary, you.
Yes, sir. Please, Professor. I would like to know for me. I would like to know the issue for me to use my. I would like to know about language production, Professor. For me, I can produce my first language, my mother tongue, easily without teaching from someone or something. For example, grammar pattern of Myanmar, how to speak, what we will have to speak. Although we don't need to teach from our mother or from our teacher, we can speak very well and very pleased to produce our mother tongue or our first language. But although I have studied second language, for example, English, from 5 years old, still now, I'm not very pleased and can produce very well like first school in our country. I would like to know why we have to encounter this issue for first language and second language. For first language, although we can speak very well, we can write very well without having enough teaching from our teachers or someone, we can produce and we can speak and we can write very well, not to teach from someone. But for second language in production, we have difficulty. For example, in pronunciation or in grammar or in vocab, although we have tried to study or we have to taught in our class, or some students said, some student or some parents or some teachers said, although we have learned English second language for about 10 years, we can't get enough knowledge from this language. Why? I also want to know this issue very well, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. For your question, in fact, this issue is very has been concerns in the linguist, and I would like to show you that your question concerning to the scope of the language of the study language acquisition of the native language. And the second problem about the study of the second language is concerned with the acquisition of the bilingualisms. In psycholinguistics, we separate the explanation between the acquisition of the native language and the bilingualisms, because in the native language, as you observe that everyone can use it very easy. We don't have the teacher to teach us, but we look like that we learn by ourselves. But in fact, from the study of the psycholinguistic, the person who learned the first language, they did not learn by themselves automatically, but they learn from the environments. For example, when we are the children, we meet our parents, we meet our look like the person who take care of us, and we learn from their language. So this language is look like the input that the person get it unconsciously. For example, when I was young, I have a lady who take care of me. She come from the northeast regions of Thailand, and she talked to me use the dialect of the northeast regions of Thailand. So I can speak the northeast dialects really well. But for now, she left me when I was teenager, and after that, I didn't listen the northeast dialect from her. I don't hear the northeast dialect from anyone. So at the moment, I can't speak the northeast dialect anymore. So this is the example that is occur when we acquire the native language or the first language. So in the psycholinguistic, we focus on I summarize that we focus on two issues. The first one we call is the innate abilities. Innate is mean that the ability inside yourself, inside a people. This issue is focused in the theory of Noam Chomsky. I think that you ever hear this name. Noam Chomsky focused on the innate ability as the first one. And this theory is developed further. From the theory of from the factors of innate ability, we also found that the innate ability is not permanent because it can be lost if a person don't get the external factors that appropriate for them to develop a language at the appropriate times. I use the word appropriate time because if you observe from yourself, if you learn any language when you was young, for example, you learn English when you was young. A way to learn to pronounce English, the one way is to repeat your speaking when you hear the person talk to you. So this one, you will use your tongues as the ability of the tongue of the articulation can do. But if the time pass away, if the time pass, the full ability to control your tongues on the left, on the right, or to touch any the other articulation will lose. So you will pass the appropriate time to develop your good speaking. So the innate ability need to be activated, need to be used at the appropriate time also, that you have to depend on the other or the external factors. So this is the concept of the native language. But for the concept of the bilingualisms, the bilingualisms, the factor of the innate ability is not usually don't play the important role in the bilingualisms, but we can apply the concept of the innate ability some issue to develop bilingualisms. But the situation that you propose, that you observe that we study English for a long time, but we can't use the English as well as the English native speaker use. I answer this question from the previous research, and some part is my research on the bilingualism. We found that there are many factors, many situations that influence the development of the second language. For example, the difference between language. And the difference between language is not only the general laws, but we have to focus on that which aspect of the language is different. For example, we are Thai, we study English. From my research, we found that, for example, the pronunciation of English consonants and vowels, the different type of English consonant will cause the difficulty to pronounce in Thai people. Some English consonant, it can be pronounced by Thai people very easily, no problems. But some consonant category, very difficult to teach them to pronounce. And sometimes we have to accept that some consonants, Thai people can't pronounce similar or the same as the native language speakers. Because why? Because this consonant category don't have in Thai language system. We have to accept that, for example, I am Thai. Sometimes I pronounce English language by transfer the Thai language characteristic to English pronunciation. However, if we study English in the past, in the previous time, that the student studies the second language in the traditional concept. In linguistics, we use the traditional approach. That this approach, we agree that the learner must use the language as the native language use. It's in that the traditional concept. We will not accept the difference language English pronunciation from the Thai pronunciation. But at the present, in the psycholinguistic, in fact, in the psycholinguistic fields, we accept the difference from the people who speak, who use the language. But we concern that they use the different, for example, Thai people use the different English pronunciation in appropriate situation. For example, today I present the information in the academic situation. I present with the teacher, with the student in the academic forums. So I have to try to use English as well as the native speaker, as well as the academic language. But when I come back to my friends and I use the English talk to them, sometimes I will not concentrate that I have to use the English as the full sentence. I will use the English as the word by words because I agree that my friend can understand my English in that situation, in the informal situation. But in the academic situation, I will not use the word by words because this is the academic situation. So in the psycholinguistic study, we accept that if a person will use a language different from the native speaker, but they have to use the language in the correct or appropriate situation. And for your and for the next issue, I think that you interest that like how we develop the second language to be good, to be better as a native speaker. In the study of the psycholinguistic, as I told you already, there are many factors related to the developments of the bilingualisms. I will show you as a basic factors. This one we call is the exposure. Exposure is mean that how frequently that you use the second language. You can observe from the people from the countries that they use the English or the second language in daily life. They can speak or use English better than the people from the country that don't use English in daily life. Is the factor of exposure. And if we are the teacher, how can we help our students who live in the country that don't use English or the second language in daily lives? The way to help our students is to provide the way to help them to get higher exposure or to get more frequently to use the language. So this is the basic factor that we see it in our daily lives. So some of my students, they try to find the way to help themselves to get more frequently to use English. Someone try to watch a movie, try to listen to the songs, but they get more frequently. But the limitation is that the form of the language that they get from the song, that they get from the movie, that they get from the games, it may be different from the standard language. So this one, that the factor that we have to concern when we try to help them to have the higher exposure of the language in daily lives. So we have to concentrate on the form, on the styles of the language that they will get. Okay, this one I share you some information about your question. But if you are interested in this, how to develop the bilingualisms, you can study more in the research of psycholinguistics because there are many theories study on this issue, and different theory will propose look like the position in the developments of the bilingual slightly different. But for my question, for my answer, I try to summarize look like the basic factor, the basic issue concerning this way. Okay, thank you, Mary. Okay. Ajahn Mary, are you okay for my answer? Ajahn Mary, can you hear my voice? Okay.
Like, thanks. Her connection is not constrained.
Okay,ค่ะ.
Please Janmon, I think you raised your hand for a while. And Sitisak, right?
Yes, Professor, thank you. I have one question. According to the mental lexicon, the learner will learn by mental lexicon. It means learner can learn words in many ways or is very flexible. And why? Also, the learner can learn from the dictionary, but it's one way to find the words, as the professor talked. So, yeah, learning the word by mental lexicon and learning from dictionary only one way. Which one is more appropriate to teach students in class, or the teacher can apply both ways or integrate both ways? And which one is more appropriate for students at different contexts and different age? Yes, thank you.
Okay. From your question, I will the first one, I would like to clarify the difference between the dictionary and the mental before. The mental lexicon is your word knowledge that in your cognition. Where is the dictionary is a book that the student learn from the book. So the mental lexicon is not the concept that the student learn from the mental lexicon, but the mental lexicon is the concept that when the student have the knowledge of a language, that knowledge will keep in the mental lexicon. So in the mental lexicon, we have the two keywords. The first one, the storage, and the second one is the access. So from your question, it's not learning from the mental lexicon, but mental lexicon is the way to storage and access your word, our word knowledge. And the keyword that I use that the mental lexicon is flexible is represent that the ability of the human to storage and to access their word knowledge from the mental lexicon is flexible. We don't access the knowledge from the mental lexicon by using only one way, but we can store it and access by using many different ways based on the communication that we encounter.
Okay, Professor. So it means that the mental lexicon is not the learning way, but it's the storage and access way of the words, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Ask more. Okay.
So teacher, so using dictionary is a way to learn the words, and after that, when the learners acquire the words, they understand and know the word meaning. So it will be their mental lexicon for storage and access. Is that right?
Your question is true, but it's not all true. Okay.
Oh, okay, I see.
Yes, because in the mental lexicon, the information of the word is not only the meaning. If you study the mental lexicons, we will find that the word knowledge of a person it has the start from the level of sounds that we call is the phonetic level or phonological levels, and move step by step to the morphological, syntactic, pragmatic, semantics, and also some model of the mental lexicon include the knowledge of the situation when we use the word or the language. So in the mental lexicons, the storage of meaning is a part, but it storage the other information of the word also.
Okay. Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much.
Oh, okay, can I ask? According to Assistant Professor Siddhisak Pongpihin questions, you mentioned about the cognitions. So, could you please explain more about the cognitive psychologies and their psychological linguistic? Like, are there any work or research comparing about this? And which one is more like useful in learning language ค่ะ
ค่ะ ขอบคุณอาจารย์ค่ะ Your question I have to concern with the history of the developments of psycholinguistics. It's about the developments of psycholinguistics as a field. If you study the period of the development of psycholinguistics, the first period is look like that you use the word cognitive psycholinguistic. In the first period, the weight, as I told you already, that psycholinguistic is the work of linguistics and psychology together. So the first period of psycholinguistic, that's it. You use the word cognitive. When we explain the language situation problem, we will use the knowledge of psychology more than the knowledge of the linguistic. But for the psycholinguistic in the later periods, there is the balance when we use the knowledge of psychology and linguistic to explain the language situation. I think that you still have the question. To answer
the differences.
Okay. To give you more clarity about this question, I will show you the other slides that I prepare from the previous time, but not for this time, to make you more understand in the difference between the cognitive psycholinguistic and the psycholinguistic. Okay, so I will stop share this slide before, and I will go to the next slide. Okay, wait me to change my slides. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Wait me a moment. My slide is in this one. I have to connect this one to my computers.
Please be informed that we also have Professor Gambi from Manipur University. He is the head of English department. He also joined this session. And Professor Panornuang also, we have very active female professor from Myanmar as well. She's coming to join us very soon. Professor Nini from Mandalay Distance Education also will come in. Dr. Nomin also here, I guess, because I saw his name. Dr. Nomin is Vice President. He's a Vice President taking care of International Relations Office, but he is the ELT Curriculum Committee under my supervision. But sometimes I am under his supervision, but sometimes he is under my supervision. All right, we have got so many hats at the same time. All right, Dr. Nomin also here. So today we are very lucky to have not just only the students, but also administrators, professors from different institutes because of Professor Panornuang, I guess. So we gather together at this time. Maybe by the end of Dr. Panornuang session, we have a group photo together. All right. Now I think you set up your thumb drive already, Professor Panornuang.
Yes, already.
Please keep going on.
To answer your question, this one is a part of my book. I explain it in the first chapter of a book. So you can look at the second topic. This one is a history of the psycholinguistic. The psycholinguistic, we have the look like the two periods of the development. The first period is the development, and the scholar is the psychologist. So in this period, the psycholinguistic will use the look like the psychological disciplinaries to explain the language situation rather than or more than with or more weight with the linguistic theories. And then for the second period, the law of the language is more important to explain in the psycholinguistic. So the weight between the psychology theory and linguistic theory is balanced, is more balanced in this the second period to explain the language situation. But in fact, then to answer your question, another answer is that I would like you to look at the developmental step of the modern psycholinguistic that I mentioned in my book. Your question is concerned between the third step, that the cognitive period, and then the last step, that the psycholinguistic theory period. So I will move to the next page to give you the short summarize that what is the difference between the cognitive and psycholinguistic. Okay. In the cognitive period, in this period, the language is one of several fundamental cognitive process outcomes. So in the notion of the cognitive period, the language is one of the outcome of general cognitive process. But in the period of the psycholinguistic study, In the period of the psycholinguistic studies, the important characteristic is that psycholinguistic does not base on neither linguistic or cognitive psychologies, but is the integration between these both fields in the balanced way. So this is a difference between the cognition period and the psycholinguistic period. Ajahn Tensuda, are you okay?
Okay.
I try to answer every question.
Yes, thank you so much for your clear and useful information. And I just try to manage, okay, which one is better if you want to study or apply for language studies. I just try to manage myself with this.
And if you're interested in psycholinguistic, I invite you to our family, psycholinguistic family. I think that is this field is very interesting and fun and funny. And I think that is amazing.
Thank you, Professor, for your knowledge about psycholinguistic. I would like to ask a question about, is it possible to do like analyze literature using psycholinguistic?
Excuse me, what is your question?
Is it possible to use psycholinguistic analysis in literature?
Okay. You mean that use the apply the analysis of psycholinguistic
Yes.
in ELT, right?
Yes.
Yes. In English language teaching. Okay. For your question, I prepare this this information and the example how you can apply the issue of psycholinguistic in ELT research in the next part of my slides. Because in the next part of my slides, I give you the example of the research and I summarize that which issue of psycholinguistic that put in this research and what issue of the ELT that this research focus. คุณศิระประภาใช่ไหมคะ Okay, can you hear my answer?
Yes, I think my internet is not good.
Oh, okay, so
Sorry.
yeah. So for your question, I will show you the example in the next slides.
Yes, teacher. I would like to ask a question. And how does language relate to psychology?
Can you repeat your question again?
Yes, teacher. I would like to ask a question. How does language relate to psychology?
Related to psychology, right?
Yes, language relate to psychology.
For your question, I give you the example before. For example, I am Ajahn Omas, right? What is your native language?
Yes, my native language is Myanmar.
Is Myanmar?
Yes.
Right? So I will give you the examples. I will give myself as one of example, and maybe Dr. Ajahn Omas is an example. Okay. My native language is Thai. So I will have so my cognition, my knowledge, the word perception is influence is the influence of Thai language. So for example, in Thai language, we have the many words about the Thai food, about the Thai spices like that. So in my knowledge of the world, I will know the difference between the spicy, the chili, the pepper, because my knowledge get the influence from the Thai language. So at the same time, your native language is Myanmar. Your knowledge about the world will be influenced from the Myanmar language. For example, from your vocabulary, from the meaning of your language. So this one of the example that why language and the psychology is related. And in the psycholinguistic, we try to use both the knowledge of linguistics and psychology to explain the same phenomenon, to make the explanation clearly and look at the both sides of the linguistic and the psychology and put the explanation from both sides to be balanced to explain the situation. And from your question, in fact, there are many research that try to study and investigate the language cognition, the language the learner's cognition, the learner psychology that related to the language that the learner use. For example, I read a research that conduct in the Korean language. In the Korean language, it has the feature that they use the vowel to represent the meaning. And the vowel that represent the meaning is not the system in the other language. For example, it's not in the system of Thai language. So the research revealed that the influence of the vowel to represent some meaning will influence the cognition or the mental, the psychology concerning the world perception of the person who use that language. This is the example that I ever read research concerning this issue. And there are many research in many languages that concerning the relation between the human psychology or the cognition with the language characteristic.
Thank you, teacher. Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much.
The organizer, I think that this is a time to break a moment.
Yes, Professor. Yes. Just 10-minute break and go on the second section, right?
Ma'am, can I ask one question, please?
Yes, go on.
Simon Soji is doing PhD at Manipur University. She's from Myanmar as well.
Yes.
Simon, so please.
Yes, ma'am. My research topic is related with culture in ELT, and then I'm supposed to study the attitudes of teachers and students to how their attitudes toward the culture teaching, integrating culture teachings in ELT classroom. But and I know that if I study attitude, I need to study 3 factors: is affection, behavior, and cognitive. So if I study not attitude, if I study perception, so which factor do I need to study?
You mean that perception?
Yes, ma'am. Perception, yes.
To answer this question, I will give you the information that for the perception in psycholinguistic, we have the we divide it as a different steps. So before you will conduct a research to study the perception, you should specify that which step of the perception that you want to study. And to make your research more interesting, you should specify that what aspect of the language teaching or what aspect of the language content that you want your your subject or your student to get or to acquire in the perception process. And then if you can specify already, you can select the research method that appropriate to your research question.
Thank you, ma'am.
You take a break for 10 minutes. All right. Enjoy your break. So sorry, Professor Panornuang, we cannot serve you with very tasty a cup of coffee. Maybe next time for sure at your campus. Enjoy your break.
Okay. That's okay.
Yes, Professor, you can going on or second
Yes,
section.
I'm ready.
Yes.
Are you ready? Okay. For this section, I will talk about the second language acquisition and specify to English language teaching research. In this slide, I show you the definition and the scope of second language acquisition. For the second language acquisition theories, we investigate how people acquire the second or third or fourth language. The purpose of the second language acquisition is to understand how people acquire the bilingual language or the multilingual, and to determine the related factors influencing second language acquisition. In this slide, I provide you the brief summary of the theoretical perspective of second language acquisition. The first one is a nativist theory or the naturalistic aspect. In this aspect, the assumption is that language acquisition is innately determined, and any humans are born with a system of language. So the example of the important theory in this approach is the 5 hypotheses of custom theories. I think that some of us studied this theory before. The second approach is the environmental approach. The assumption is that an organism experience is more important role to language development rather than the nature or innate contribution. The example of important theory is the connectionism theories. The third approach is the social interactionist approach. This approach includes both innate and environmental factors in order to explain the language acquisition. The example of the important theory is the zone of proximal development theories. So for the next slides, I will show you the information if we work on the theoretical perspectives and the second language study perspectives. The first one, I specify to the first purpose of the second language acquisition. The first one that we study is how people acquire second or the third language or the other language rather than the native. In this scope, the basic issue is to study the perception and production in both the spoken word, visual or the written word, and study in different characters of language learners. And the last one is a comparative study between or among language. This is the example of the previous research that I give you the example to in fact that you may get the idea from the previous research that how we use this concept in conducting the research. The first one is the study of the production in spoken word. For example, there is a research concerning the errors due to speaker self-monitoring speech planning. In fact, in psycholinguistics, the study of errors is an important issue and is common study in order to understand the human language production. Or the study of the word planning. The keyword word planning is mean the process that the person plan or process before we pronounce the word. So the study of the word planning, we can study, for example, the activation of the form information, even the phonology, morpheme, and lemma representation in a speech recognition. Or the example of the study of the spoken word perception that we study in the consonant and vowels in the categorical perception. Or the study of the integrated auditory and visual information in perception. This is example for the study of the visual word recognition. For example, the research study the word frequency of occurrence as the influence of the visual word recognition, or the study of the relationship between the visual and spoken word recognition. This one is an example of the research in these fields that you can, if you're interested, you can come back to this research and read its details. Or the issue of the relationship between the perception and production. For example, in my research, I studied the relationship between the perception and production of the foreign language sounds. And I found the relationship that I can categorize it as the ordering of the difficulty in the relation between the perception and production. For the second aim of the second language acquisition is to study the factors affecting language acquisition. So in this slide, I summarize that there are two main types of the factors that we interested. The first one is the internal factors. For example, the age, the personality, the experience, the cognition, and native language of the learners. And the second one is the external factors. For example, curriculum, instruction, culture, status, motivation to access to the native speakers. So in this slides, I give you more specific examples in the study of the second language acquisition. This one is a popular and common issue in the second language acquisition. That is the study of the bilingual language processing. I try to summarize the basic issue that we study. The first one, the study of the role of the first language in learning second language. The second one is the dynamics of a bilingual mental lexicon. The word dynamics is mean that from the previous research, and our assumption is that a lexicon is a dynamic cognition. It means that it can change. For example, when you first study the English, the mental lexicon may be not strong enough, not good enough. But when you study English, more in the vocabulary, in the input, your mental lexicon will be developed better. And then if the mental lexicon is developed better. It doesn't mean that it will be better for all the times. It can, the development of the mental lexicon can be lost if you don't use that language anymore. So this is the meaning of the dynamic of the mental lexicon. The third issue is that the effect of the first and the second proficiency on the first and second storage and processing. And the last one is the factors influencing second language proficiencies. So the research examples, I give two examples from the previous research. For example, the first research, they investigate whether there is any impact on the subject language proficiency on the use of L1 in L2 writings. And the second research example come from my research on the model of the mental lexicon in bilingual and in bilingual with the high and low second language experience. In fact, this one is my doctoral research. Okay. And another, my research report entitled The Second Language Acquisition and Context Cue Strategies in different degree of the cultural specific. That in this research, I study the influence of the different degree of cultural specific and context cues in the second language acquisition. So move to the next example of the research issue. This example is the research conduct in the multilingual language processing. In the psycholinguistic issue, we interested to study the difference between the bilingual language processing and multilingual language processing. Two basic issues is that we study whether and how processing multilingual language is different from processing two language, and the effects of the bilingual and multilingual language on human cognition. And the other issue is a difference between the acquisition of the third language and the second language. Because in the previous research, it showed that there is some process that is different between the acquisition of the third and the second language. And this is a research examples. The first one, the research conduct to study the influence of language on cognitive processing in the old population. And the research revealed a significant effects of a number of languages. And the next research, I provide the example from my research in 2015 that I study across 4 languages, Thai, English, Lao, and Vietnamese translation equivalence in the language processing. That for my study, the basic finding is that the language within the same language families and have the translation equivalence in 2 languages. The person will, the processing between these 2 languages will be better as compared to the processing between the language which come from the different language families. So the results are implied to the effects of trilingualism and bilingualisms that depending on the similarities among 2 or 3 languages. And this slide I show this one is the important concept when we study across language acquisition. This concept, we call it interference. Now, I will talk about this concept. That what does it mean for the interference? Interference is mean that a language interferes with learning a new language. For example, my first language is Thai, and I learned English as a foreign language. So the system of Thai language and the foreign language, some feature is similar, some feature is different. For example, that is a very clear example is the feature of phonetics. In Asian language, for example, Thai, we have the intonation, right? Intonation look like that Thai have the ek to 3. And maybe in Laos, in Myanmar, you have the intonation, right? But the feature of intonation is not in the English language. Sorry, I use the incorrect word. I have to use the word tone, not intonation. Sorry. The feature of tone is not in the English language. English language has a feature of stress and unstressed, right? But when Thai speaker try to pronounce the English word, they will use the tone instead of the stressing. For example, I saw my students when they have to test the English speaking, they will put the tone symbol in Thai in the syllable of English word to represent that it's stressed or unstressed. So this one is the example that the learner used the first language character to interfere to the second language characters. And this situation, we call it the first language interference. However, in the psycholinguistic, the first language interference can provide two results in the second language learning. The first result, I use the word positive. So it means that the first language interference help the learner to study the second language better. But the second result, I use the word look like is negative. That is the first language interference will does not help the learner to study second language better. It provides the negative results in the study of the second language. For example, that Thai student, they usually use the feature of tone in speaking straight and unstraight words in English. This one is a negative interference because it will make the learner don't use the feature of straight and unstraight in English sound, but they will use the feature of Untitled in Thai instead. And this will make them slower to study English speaking. So for the word or concept of the interference, it will be occurred in both from the first language to the second language, or in both to the first language to the third language learning. So it can occur in every step or every direction when we learn a new language. And in these slides, another issue is that we can predict the nature of interference from comparison between the system of the first and the second language. For example, I can predict that Thai pupil will transfer which feature of Thai language in study English language. Or you can predict that if you will teach English language in your country? Which feature of your first language that will interfere to the study of the second language? The prediction is confirmed that you compare the language feature of two languages. And then we will move to how we imply the second language acquisition studies to the foreign language teaching and learning. In fact, we can use the notion of the second language acquisition in the research of foreign language teaching and learning in many issues. For example, the issue of the material development and evaluation, the designs of the syllabus or the curriculums, language testing, language teaching methods and techniques, language teacher training and education, research in the second and foreign language learning, language education policy and language planning, education technology and language learning, or the language education in multilingual settings. And then from these figures, I would like to show you that the concept of the second language acquisition can be merged or can be implied in the issue of the language teaching in many levels. The first one, as a first level, it can be implied in the issue concerning the study of a particular learners, and move to the study of the classroom or the environments around the learner, the study of the role of the teacher in the language teaching. Or you can provide the study based on the policy, the curriculum, the syllabus, the testing, and move to the highest level. That's the level of the planning and the policy concerning the language teaching and learnings. In the next slides, I try to give you the example of the research issue concerning the integrating psycholinguistic study in the research of teaching of foreign language and bilingual studies. This is the example of the research issue that I will briefly show you. The first one, the study of the significant factors concerning the second language and bilingualism development, the study of how to develop the effective second language teaching and learning method, the study of the influence of the language typologies on the teaching and learning. So for the example of the research I show you, the first one is the study in teaching a foreign language, the management of the student activities to develop various types of speech activities must be based on account peculiarities and linguistic ability of the student. And the second one I show you from my research that I apply the analysis of significant factors of bilingual development in the development of foreign language teaching. In these papers, I developed the English online learning using the local cultural education resource in Bangkok in order to investigate the meaning transparency between Thai and English. The word meaning transparency is mean that when you study the meanings, you will have the meaning of word that is transparency in the high degree or the lower degree of transparencies. For this study, the assumption is that the learner can learn easier or faster in the word or the concept that is more transparency compared to the concept that is less transparencies. Another example from my research, I studied the relationship between the consonant perception and production acquisition with the function of the phonemic awareness. In these studies, I applied the knowledge of the psycholinguistic in the consonant perception and production acquisition and the concept of phonemic awareness. In psycholinguistic, the word awareness is mean that the learners or the language speaker aware the difference between two languages. For example, I am Thai speaker and I have the phonemic awareness in English consonants, that what is the consonant that is the pronunciation is similar to Thai, or which the consonant that the pronunciation is different from Thai. So if I have the awareness like this, when I try to develop my English consonant production and perception, I will be better to develop this perception and production rather than the person who don't have the awareness in this similarity or this difference. In fact, the concept of awareness, you can apply this concept in every level when you study the second language acquisition or in foreign language teaching and learning. For example, I study in a work that I use the cultural awareness as a function to develop the second language skill. The cultural awareness, mean that the subject or the learners has the awareness about that which type or which aspect of the culture in the second language or the third language is different from the first culture. This is because the language and the culture is related. So the assumption is that if the subject or the learner have the good awareness in culture of the second language or the third language, they will develop the ability to use the second or the third language better, especially the ability in vocabulary learnings. So for my research, this research applied to the second language and foreign language learning in the field of English consonant. And if I will apply this research in the policy of the language education or in the language education or in the curriculum designs, I will apply the concept of the role of phonemic awareness in the learnings, in curriculum design, in the activity designs. For the next example, I give you the example from my research project that conduct in this year. In this research project, I got the funding from the National Research Council of Thailand to develop the e-book and thesaurus using interlanguage common-based concept to develop Thai local dialects, English and Chinese language uses for the cultural tourism. In this research topic, I apply the notion of the psycholinguistic is a common-based concept based on the theory of Lyon 1977. The issue of the semantic relation, development of the vocabulary size, development of the foreign language. I will explain briefly about the concept of the vocabulary size. The vocabulary size is mean that the numbers of the vocabulary that the learner have in cognition. And in this research project, I apply to the English language teaching or the second language teaching in the fields of the material development. I developed the ebook and thesaurus using the psycholinguistic issue about, and I also apply to the context of the language learning that I will teach the local dialects, English and Chinese language in my subjects. That in this project, my subject is the primary student and the general people in the communities. So for the information of the presentation, for the next issue, I will show you the psycholinguistic research method. That is a common method that we use to correct the data. But however, before I will move to the next part of my presentation, I will let the participants to ask your question before I will move to the issue of the research method. Hello, any participant? Do you have a question about my previous slides? I want to hear your question before I will move to the next issue of the slides.
Professor?
Yes.
Okay, Professor, okay, are you done with the present project 2021?
Yes.
Okay, I'm so curious about this project, and as I'm listening to your talk, I have got some ideas about doing research about the Thai local dialect, especially in my area in the northeast of Thailand. And I saw your project, yes, this year 2021. You got the Thai dialects, and it's quite complicated to me, and I'm so curious. And okay, if you're pleased, I would like to read the research report to further my idea and my concept in pursuing to do research in this field, Professor. Yes.
So the final research report will be in the next year. because now this project I work for 6 years already, and I have more 6 months, not 6 years. 6 years is too long. I work for 6 months already, and I have more time for 6 months to finish this project. But in fact, this project for me, the local dialect is very interesting, because before I propose this project, I will give you the information concerning this project a little bit. Before I propose this project to the fundings, I concentrate on the English and Chinese language, because in fact I'm in the fields of the English, and also myself I study Chinese also. So the first time I concentrate on these two languages. And I didn't propose to study the local dialect, but the research committees, they give me the suggestion to include the local dialects in these studies because in the local area of any countries, then we have the local dialects, and the local dialect is very important from the daily lives of the person living in the communities in that areas. So the research committee suggests me to include the local dialects of the area that I studied. And now I correct the data about the local dialect already to put it in the ebook, in my ebook. And I found that some local dialects, it's very difficult to find the subject who can speak the local dialect correctly. So this will be to give you the idea how, if you're interested to include the local dialect in your study. Because usually when we talk about the bilinguals or the multilinguals, we will concentrate on the other language outside our country. But in fact, the local dialects, it can use the concept of the second language acquisition or the foreign language acquisition. If our subject don't know how to speak the local dialects before. So it can be that Thai standard can be the first language and Thai local dialect can be the second language or the foreign language to them, like that.
Okay, so so far, have you been done with the ebook and the thesaurus?
Yes.
So do you publish the ebook, or where can general people get access to the ebook, Professor?
If I decide my ebook is online. Yes, because in fact, I decided this project because I think that when we have the problem of COVID-19, the person moved themselves to the online platforms more. And then after the COVID-19 problem may be finished in the futures, but the lives of people stay enjoy the online platforms. Even we can come to the classroom and study, but the online platform still have the influence to our life already. So I decided this work as an online books.
So what's the specific Thai dialect? Because we have so many different local dialects in the north and the south. So what is the specific dialect, or what part of Thailand is the dialect?
I conduct this project in a province, in a province that the dialect is the dialects of the local people who live in this province from the previous time before the present, and some dialect now the native speaker can't speak it anymore. So I include this dialect in these studies. But I don't tell you that which dialects. So you can predict that which province I conduct this research. In fact, yes, because I can conduct the research like this in many provinces, because different provinces will have the local dialects and the local people. So I'm okay if this research will give you idea to conduct the research in your province or in the community around your universities. But if you conduct, you can tell me that, okay, I conduct this one in my university already.
Okay, Professor. Okay. To be honest, okay, I really would like to study your ebook and your thesaurus. Okay, when you are ready to publish or when you are ready to give us a chance to read those materials. I would like to begin from reading your materials, and it will be great contribution to my future research in this field. Okay, and I have your contact and contact you later. Yes, promise. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yes.
Hello, dear Professor. May I ask one question, please?
Yeah.
Yes. Before I start to ask my question, firstly, I'd like to explain one of my experience concerning psycholinguistics. Recently, one of my students asked and suggested me about his problem, and he explained about his psychological interfere. Is that he said he stressed out at the moment and he has depression. So I asked my student for what and how. And then he explained about his current problem or because during this moment. On this based on this experience in my mind, I've ended up to know about the psycholinguistics. Because for me, I think in learning psycholinguistics is very important to our psychological response to words and languages, right? So in doing this, the study of the influence or psychological factors on the development, use and interpretation of language is also very important. So when my student asked me this question, and then here I'm in double mind under the two factors, because the depressions are sometimes it's maybe we are controlling our thoughts, or sometimes it may be our thoughts are controlling us. So in my mind, I've ended up under these two factors. So when I trying to solve my my student, because I know that as a teacher, sometimes I will be a motivator as well as the advisor for my students. So here my question is, can cultural interference affect in learning linguistics, especially psycholinguistics? I would like to know about this question, please.
Yes. Oh, it's a long question. But
Yes.
very long question, teacher. So I summarize your question. I summarized your question before, and you told me that I understand your question correctly. Your question is that how to reduce the interference in the language learning in your student, right?
Yes.
In fact, for this question, I have to answer using the theory of the language interference. Because in fact, the language interference has a specific theory to explain. However, the basic is that how to reduce the language interference is to increase the skill, the ability of the learners. But for the next question is, and how we can increase the skill and the ability of the learner in order to reduce the interference. If we explain based on the theory of the mental lexicons, because in the theory of the mental lexicon, it includes the phenomena of the language interference. In the theory of the mental lexicon, I ever studied this case in the doctoral degrees, and I used the previous theory concerning the mental lexicons, and I designed the experiment and find the answer that if we want to reduce the interference between the first and the second language, we have to increase look like that, increase the exposure of the learner to the second language in order to make them increase the ability to use the second language. And in my research, I use the word to increase the experience. The exposure and the experience, in my opinion, is quite the same concept. If you increase the experience to the student to use the second language, they will get the high exposure to use the second language. And if they get the high experience, high exposure, their ability to use the second language will be higher, and then it will reduce the interference from the first language. So for example, if your student have the depression when they have to talk in the second language, the basic way to help them is to provide them a chance to practice a talk. But for the student who has a depressed to talk, the chance that we provide them to practice, maybe the first time is not the formal practice, but should be used the informal practice. This is because the informal practice will help them to release the depressed. But because if you use the formal practice to the student, they will excite things and they will depress us. What should I do in the formal situation? So we give them the informal chance to help them to use the language, to use the second language before. And when they have the more experience in to use the second language, they will get the better ability to speak. Then they will move to the formal talking situation and without the depression or less the depression. This for my research, previous research, and for my experience.
Thank you very much for your kind and detailed explanation. It's very effective. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I will move to the last section of my presentation. I will introduce you the basic method, basic instrument in the psycholinguistic that you can, I think that it will be benefit for you to use it or to apply it in your data collection in your fields. In this slide, in the last section of this presentation, I try to summarize the basic research method in psycholinguistics. I use the word basics because, in fact, if you go in the detail of each method, it will have the many different details that I will show you later. Usually, from my book entitled Modern Psycholinguistics, I talk that the psycholinguistic is naturally an experimental field, and the method that we collect the data, I divide it as the naturally occurring method and the experimental method. First one, I will introduce very classic method to collect the data from the natural language uses. The first one, We call it a slip of the tongue. A slip of the tongue is a phenomenon and also is a method that we correct the data. The definition of the slip of the tongue is that an evolutionary performance derivation from the speaker, current phonological, grammatical, or lexical intention. The slip of the tongue is the common language communication situation. For example, I can observe my slip of the tongue during my presentation. For example, I have the error when the error in my presentation using my language like that is an example of a slip of the tongue. Or sometimes you want to talk this sentence, but your pronunciation is not moved to all of the sentence. It starts at the first word of that sentence. It's an example of the slip of the tongues. So the slip of the tongues is very common language communication data. And you can correct the slip of the tongue in order to analyze the language ability of the speaker. The second one is we call the tip of the tongue, TOT. The tip of the tongues is defined as the phenomenon of failure to retrieve or to access a word or a lexical item from lexical memory. For example, you want to talk about some things, but before this time, you know this word to talk about this thing. But during this time, why you can't think of the word to talk about these things? So this is the failure to retrieve or to access a word. The failure to retrieve or access the word is usually accompanied with partial recall and the feeling of imminent retrieving. For example, I have this thing in my hand. Usually I know that what word called this thing. But today when I will talk about this thing, I can't recognize the vocabulary to represent this thing. So this is the example of the tip of the tongue. Or sometimes I feel that I ever know this word, but why today I think that I can't remember all of this word. So this is the example of the tip of the tongues. Another kind of the method, I call it the offline and online method. Because this method, you can conduct it in both offline and online. I propose that the first one is a questionnaire. I think that everyone know to use the questionnaire, so I will not go in detail of the characteristic of this type. The second one is a various types of various kind of the test. And the last one is a different types of the task. For example, priming task, lexical decision task, naming task, and stop task. So in the next part of the slides, I will give you the example of the last type of the method, that is priming task, lexical decision, naming, and the stop task. Because all of this is a basic method that uses in the psycholinguistic to correct the language data. In this slide, I give you the figure to present the nature of the priming task. In fact, for the priming task in general, it means that the task that you give the input the first input, and then you give the second input, and you ask your subject to respond to the second input. You can ask the subject to respond in different ways. For example, respond by pronouncing, respond by selecting and the correct item like that. So the way that you ask the subject to respond to the second item is the way that the researcher have to decide based on their research question. For example, if you're interested in speaking, you can decide the response that asks your subject to pronounce the second word that you show. So the task of priming task, the priming task is applied to use to study in various aspects of the language. And there are the subtypes of the priming task in the psycholinguistic. In this slide, I show you two subtypes of the priming task. The first one we call it repetition priming task. In the repetition primings, the basic concept is that we will use the same words as the first task, as the first input and the second input. And in the design of the priming paradigms, we will give the non-language input before the first language input, and we give the non-language input before we give the second language input. And then we will ask the subject to respond to the second language. In fact, I would like to tell you that the types of the non-language input, you can decide based on your research question that what type of the input that you will show to your subjects. And for the time that we show each input to the subject, in fact, there are the research that work on the calculation of the appropriate timings that we use to show the first, the second input to the subjects. However, the fundamental method that we calculate the appropriate timing is that the concept of the priming effects. We want that the subject to process the first input as the unconscious, and then process the second input as the conscious. So the timing that appropriates for the first input, we have to use the timing that make the subject process the first input as unconscious, not conscious. So for the second type of the priming that I show you, I show you the semantic priming paradigms. The semantic priming is that we use the word which has the meaning relation at the first and the second input. So in these examples, the first input is the word cat. The second input is the word rat. And we ask the subject to respond to the second input, rat. And in fact, you can design the semantic priming task to measure to study many different kinds of the semantic relation. For example, if you're interested to study the opposite relation of meaning, you can decide to use the first and second input which have the opposite meaning, or if you're interested to study the meaning which are similar or relation, you can decide to use the first and the second input with the similar meaning or related meaning. So in fact, this technique, you can design the detail based on your research question. Or if your research question, you want to study the influence of the orthographics or of the speech sound, you can design the priming task to use the first and the second input with the relation orthographics or non-relation or unrelated orthographic to study the influence of the orthographics in your language processing. Or you can conduct the priming task in the speech using the speech sounds to study the influence of the speech of the first and the second input. So for the priming task, it is a very popular task that we use to conduct the research in the psycholinguistic. This is because you can design it in various types, in various ways to evaluate your research question to test your subjects. So for the next task is we call it a lexical decision task. The basic nature of this task is that we will present a sequence of stimuli one at a time, which consists of both existing words or real words in a language and non-existing words in a language, or we call it non-word to participant. And you can decide the way that you will ask the participant to respond to the real word or non-word in your task. So for the next task is the naming task. The basic nature of the naming task is that we will ask the participant to speak the stimulus word that printed on the screen around as quickly as possible. For this task, you can decide to test the language ability of your subject in many levels of the language. For example, if you're interested to study the level of meaning, you can use the stimulus word which related to your research question. If you're interested to study the pronunciation, you can use the stimulus word which represent to the characteristic of speaking that you want to study. And the last type of the task that I will introduce you today is very classic task in psycholinguistics. We call it stroke task. The name of this task is follow the name of a scholar who developed and conduct this task. The concept of the stroke task, the basic concept is that you will show the written word that have the different meaning of the response. For example, this is the word green. I ask my subject to pronounce this word in green, but the way I show this word, I use the red ink. So the subject will process two ways. The first one process the form of the written word, that GREEN, and the second one they will process the color of the words. So the subject will have the two input in the same times. So the assumption is that the two input at the same time will have the influence to the response of the subjects. So in this task, we will correct the data of the error of response and the period of the response. The assumption is that if we show the form of the word and the input that the subject see from the word as a difference, the difference will cause the higher errors in the response or will cause the longer reaction time from the student, from the subjects. But if the word and the information from the word has only one input or has two input but in the same ways, there will be less error or the faster reaction time that we collect from the subjects. So all of the tasks that I present you today is a basic task and the basic designs. And if you're interested to any task, you can design it in more detail to measure your research question. So this is a basic that I would like to introduce you today. And if you have any question concerning each type of the task, you can answer me in the end of the presentation. And in fact, if you're interested to study more about each task, you can read or study the research that concerning each task in details. Okay, and the last slides, I would this come from my mind, and I write it as a look like at my speed. For myself, I think that the issue that that you give me today, the practical research, in my opinion, in my experience, I think that the practical research must start from the interesting and practical research issue. So this is the responsibility of the researcher, that you have to find the gap of the research in your fields in order that you can get the interesting research topic. And at the same time, your research topic should be practical enough to be used in the real world, in the real classroom, or to be applied in the futures. And then the practical research should concentrate on the research design, that the researcher should design the research methodology in the correct way and the complete way in your fields. And if you have the interesting research topics and the complete and correct research design and methodology, it will be almost 100% to make sure that you will get the testable research results, and your research results can be applied and can provide the benefits in the futures. So this last slide that I would like to share my knowledge, share my experience to all of you today. So the last one, I would like to hear your question concerning the issue that I give you the information of the research method in psycholinguistics. Okay, from the forums, do you have any question? or which technique that you are interested, especially and think that it can apply in your research or your work?
We also have Professor Nini from Mandalay Distance Education, Myanmar. She also with us. Professor Nini, would you like to share something with Professor Panornuang, please?
So, good morning, everyone. Firstly, sorry for being late. My apologies.
Okay.
This morning, I have a meeting on opening of upscaling programs for newly appointed tutors and demonstrators of NUDE under the supervision of Ministry of Education in Myanmar. And let me mention my sincere appreciation on your consideration to be part of today's webinar. So it is gratifying, and I'd like to cooperate, hoping that it is vital to the development of the research agenda and leadership of the PhD and ELD program through knowledge and connections of experts around the world. Many thanks for giving me such opportunity. And secondly, today's speaker, Professor Dr. Ayudhya, thank you for your excellent presentations as you can manage to deliver in psycholinguistics research methods, your last part. So, and then for me, it was quite informative to and give me some ideas and current research trends of English language education entitled Psycholinguistics leading to second language acquisition. So I appreciate the insight on the global and local research trends and issues in ELE presented by the professionals. It was really thought-provoking and well-presented section. Thanks again. So now let me share my knowledge very briefly regarding psycholinguistics in postgraduate English programs of Myanmar higher education institutions. So psycholinguistics is one of the main modules of MA degree program and PhD English degree program. So in our country, MA students and PhD students have to study psycholinguistics under the curriculum of the degree programs. Firstly, they have been introduced some of the claims by famous linguists, for example, Chomsky. So Chomsky claims that children are born biologically programmed for language and that it develops in the child in just the same way that other biological functions develop. And then also they have to study child language acquisition. So here under this area, they study clarification on lateralization of the brain by relating it to human language. And then they study theoretical approaches to explaining L1 acquisition. So here they have to clarify on behaviorism, innatedness, and interactionist position with regard to L1 acquisition. And then after that, they study factors affecting L2 learning. Here, they have to distinguish between language acquisition and language learning. And then second last area they have to study is second language teaching. Under that area, they enumerate with explanations and factors that could cause either success or failure in any foreign language learning. And the last area they have to study is second language learning in the classroom. So here they have to study factors that could cause either success or failure in any foreign language learning. So especially, dear professor, so in your last section, you have presented the research method of psycholinguistics for basic and advanced methods that are very useful for PhD scholars here. So all the best. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Ed.
Thank you so much for your very interesting and practical comments. We also have Professor Gambi from Manipur University with us. Professor Gambi, you will share something with our guest speaker today. Professor Gambi, can you hear me? Because his name is here, Professor Gambi.
Can I speak after 5 minutes?
Yeah.
Can I speak after 5 minutes?
No. We are going to end the session, sir. It's lunchtime now in Thailand. But what time is it in India now?
Though I'm listening, I had a guest. Today is a holiday in Manipur, India.
Oh, I see. It's a Diwali festival, I guess. Diwali festival. Okay, that's okay. Maybe now he's busy with very what's that attractive Indian festival now, because Professor Panornuang, I've been in India for nearly 6 years, so I get familiar with this festival. Yes, Professor Gambi is here. Yes, share something with our Thai professor.
Right. So anyway, I would like to congratulate the Buriram Rajabhat University for bringing the right person for the right PhD scholars, and I hope the scholars from Manipur University, they spoke to me after the first session that it was very meaningful. They want to share their views also. That's why of course, my observation will come later, but I want to give them a chance also so that they can express what they have learned or what they feel, how they can collaborate in future. So that's a good opportunity for us. Incorporating the scholars and Professor Nini from Myanmar, like, in India, though we look very similar in terms of appearance and, other linguistic similarities. And Sudasna have rightly said, in the first part that, yes, it is not, intonation, but the tone, which I referred in my social linguistics class also, which has been playing an important role in the area of psycholinguistics. So it was very appropriate, very relevant, and some of the observations given by Professor Nini Lai goes, with me, so I don't have to elaborate. But I would like to, mention few things which really, seems to be relevant. Otherwise, it will remain as unaddressed. I'm referring to the first session, morning session, where maybe what was the name of the scholar? I don't remember. Maybe Bontri, who inquired about is psycholinguistics application relevant to the study of literature? That was the question. So this is what I have been, observing and examining theses related to literature. So let me just relate a little bit, because in ELT, this psycholinguistics application is very relevant, as Professor Sudasna have rightly proved and authenticated, and her study seems to be very, very, relevant. I have come across her name over a few, articles, but I'm very fortunate because of Buriram Rajabhat University. I'm able to listen to her directly and also see her face, that she seems to be very smart and very young at the same time. So referring to the queries made by the Thai scholar is that, yes, not exactly as applied psycholinguistics. In literature, we in India have, the psychoanalysis theory, like, stream of consciousness. While we are just attending the workshop, or now while we are, attending this conference, this webinar, some of my guests came on this event, like my mind is here, but they probably must wondering, though I'm replying to them. So the process, mental consciousness, the stream of consciousness is also applied. So in literature, we call stream of consciousness is studied as a part of psychoanalytical study, which is not very new, but which seems to be very relevant in this world of global multilingual situation all over the globe. So this is what I feel. I'm just indirectly because of my position in India, we have second language, and also in Indian curriculum, literature plays a major area of our study, whereas in Thai, seems to be more towards, language education, which is my area of concern for my scholars in particular. So I would like to thank James, but the things he came up with, the kind of awareness, like what kind of project, the project itself is very highlighting and motivating for all the scholars. Myanmar, Thailand, and India, even we can think about a big project. I talked to my senior colleague, the former professor, Dr. Rajkumar Ranjan, who is the Minister of Education in Delhi. And he said, that's a good thing. I was also planning for a project yesterday we discussed, and today exactly it happened, like, Professor Sudasna rightly, highlighted bringing her own research and her own present, project. In fact, she's absolutely right. We have no right to know what project, which province her, dialects is being included in the project until and unless the project is over and submitted to the, provider. It has to be, a confidential kind of work. So once the project is over, I think we all will be able to access and, further improve so that all the scholars can also relate after their PhD, because we need more vision while we are taking our research. And this is how I really appreciate the kind of, involved, activities being initiated by Dr. Akaparon as the project coordinator of this kind of thing. So that's what, otherwise I feel on behalf of the scholars from Manipur University, and I'm sure we discussed about, exploring Laos, and one of the Lao applicant is also attending from Laos, respected monk who is a principal in Semantic province in Laos. And of course, I haven't heard from him, but I have heard from two scholars who are actively attending, including Jinmi Shou from Myanmar. And to her query, Professor Sudasna has rightly, referred to look into the research question. And I feel I'm very happy that this is the wise, expert we have in India psychologically, though we can relate it or not in the study of language, we think that what we prepare at home is not good. What is prepared in others' kitchen, my neighbor's kitchen, seems to be more, precious. So therefore, the kind of suggestion highlighted by Sudasna to the queries made by Jinmisu seems to be very relevant and practical. Hats off to you.
So, Professor Gambi, would you mind if you are, Professor Gambi, what are the things if I would like to invite Professor Panornuang or Sudasna to be the external examiner for your advisee, Siminsu, who is doing research relevant to social linguistics in Manipur University?
Yes, absolutely. This is only thing is that due to COVID, the postal charges are now very costly. I have sent to Australia, I have sent it to Bangladesh even. Sometimes postal, and if our research committee approves that thesis, then absolutely it is.
So I think in the near future we are going to have academic collaboration, not just only between Thai and India, but also Laos, Savanakhet, and also Burma. So Professor Panornuang, please get ready. After COVID-19 pandemic, we are going to visit Professor Gambi at Manipur University, and also Mandalay University of Business Education, Myanmar as well, including Laos, Samanakhet College. Oh, yeah.
Because by exchange, we can always explore better to be more practical.
Yes,
right?
yes,
so,
yes.
I would like to thank Professor Sudasna at this age. He has started involving in good project, but the beginning introduction, I was absent, but I don't know.
Sir. Yeah, that's okay.
She seems to be quite young and dynamic. She can go ahead.
She's very young. She's very young. Yeah, younger than us.
And productive research activities. So congratulations to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very so much. Thank you for your very insightful comment. And also please enjoy your very charming festival Diwali at this time. And on behalf of the program committee, the chairman of the ELT program, I would like to express my sincere thanks to our guest speaker today from Bansomdejchaopraya, Rajabhat University for her insightful, informative talk. So thank you, Lily. Thank you so much. We highly hope to have you with us again at BIU or somewhere like India and Burma and Laos that we sign MOU with. We are going to invite you to join all these academic events for sure. So now I think Dr. Kampi also assigned his students to deliver a thankful message to our professor as well after this, and then we will have the happy ending of this today's session. Thank you.
Yes, Mary, and your sincere thanks to Professor Panornuang, please.
Yes, sir. Firstly, I would like to present my heartfelt thanks to all my respected teachers and to today, Professor. We have got a lot of knowledge from your lecture. I think psycholinguistics is very useful for our human life. We have to meet so many kinds of problems and issues. Without our knowledge of mind from our mind, we cannot express our feeling correctly or meaningfully. It's also very important for our daily life and is very important in our culture or in the ELT classroom. Psycholinguistics is very important, I think, for all the field we have to encounter in our daily life or in our classroom or in our culture to communicate or each other. Today, I have got a lot of knowledge how psycholinguistics can give us to collaborate or communicate very well, and how can we do concerning psycholinguistics in research field, what method or what approach or what method we can apply in psycholinguistics and ELT. We have got a lot of knowledge from you, Professor, so very thankful to you, Professor.
Thank you very much.
อาจารย์พนอเนื่องนะครับขอบคุณนะครับ Thank you, Professor Nini. Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Gambi, and thank you so much, Dr. Kampi, who is the responsibility holder of this session. And thank you, everyone. Enjoy your lunch. See you next time. ขอบคุณครับ สวัสดีครับ Thank you. Thank you. ขอบคุณครับ